Good morning. It's early December 2024. I'm just here on the Liscombe rewilding site, which is managed by Dorset Wildlife Trust, just north of Dorchester. Just going to have a quick look at the fencing that's currently being done. So at this site, we want to kind of minimise fencing as far as possible. So, you know, in a rewilding site, you'd ideally just ring fence the site and have no real internal fencing. But at Liscombe, we've got an interesting situation, probably the best kind of circumstance, where you've got some superbly rich habitat, so lowland calcareous grassland, chalk grassland, embedded within a 335 hectare site dominated by kind of arable and improved grassland, species poor grassland. The really nice lowland calcareous grass and the chalk grassland on the site is designated Site of Special Scientific Interest, and there are some areas that are sites of nature conservation interest too. So the steep slopes we can see ahead, which kind of create a bit of an amphitheatre around Liscombe Bottom, south-facing slopes, that's where the species-rich calcareous grassland has kind of survived in this landscape, which was a mixed farm, arable and fairly intensively grazed grassland. And we obviously have legal obligations, because they're sites of special scientific interest, these chalk grassland slopes, legal obligation to bring these back into favourable condition and manage them, or ensure they remain as open species rich chalk grassland in line with the citation and the designation. So what we're doing here is having some internal fencing around the SSSI areas, the sites of special scientific interest, the grassland, and that kind of sits within a much bigger grazing unit. And the SSSI fencing will be kind of porous. So initially animals will be put in there, so cattle to mimic aurochs, which are globally extinct, the European wild cattle, which is globally extinct, and they'll graze the chalk grassland and get it back into favourable condition, which is a legal obligation. Once that's done, we can allow those animals to wander more widely between the chalk grassland slopes, the SSSI, and the wider landscape here, which is 335 hectares. And over time, hopefully, you know, the SSSI currently is kind of the crown jewels within the site. So yes, we're legally obliged, obviously, to maintain the SSSI in good heart, in favourable condition. But it also is kind of the source population in this landscape for wildlife, which we would expect to gradually expand out and colonise the poor quality areas, like the species poor grassland I'm walking on at the moment. So managing these chalk grassland slopes, or at least ensuring they're properly grazed so they remain species rich chalk grassland slopes, is entirely kind of in tune with a kind of a rewilding philosophy. And this is really the best kind of situation, where within the site you've got these little reservoirs of richness full of biodiversity embedded within a bigger landscape which isn't, and they act as the kind of the refugia up until now, and now the source populations of those calcareous, calcicole kind of wildflowers, which will spread out, and in time, hopefully, the sites of special scientific interest slopes will become unremarkable. Currently they are remarkable because that's where all the wildlife is on this site, at least the wildflowers, because it's species rich chalk grassland, but it will become unremarkable because it's a source population, and those wildflowers and the wildlife associated with them, the kind of chalk grass and butterflies and ants and that kind of stuff, will spread out across the site, be dispersed by the cattle, the aurochs, and potentially ponies as well. And so in this kind of situation, so generally speaking, rewilding projects, you would want to ring fence a site but not have internal fencing. And that's absolutely right in most rewilding projects, where you don't have these little kind of pockets of species richness, these refugia, that are basically dependent on a level of grazing and browsing. Back in the day, that would have been aurochs before we wiped them out globally. So these days we have to use the next best thing, really, which is cattle, longhorn cattle in this case. So like I say, the fencing around the SSSI, which we're just coming up to now, the new fencing that's been put in, will be porous after a bit of, initially cattle will be put within the SSSI and confined to the SSSI just to graze off, because it's in quite poor condition, to be honest. So it needs some restoration kind of management initially. But then after a while, several years probably, we will have fenced the wider landscape, the wider Liscombe site, with a ring fence, and then those cattle can be allowed to wander more widely, and the SSSI fence will become porous. And we'll monitor the situation. If the cattle kind of range across the site and kind of graze and browse sufficiently within the SSSI elements of the site to keep them in good condition from a SSSI point of view, then we won't really need to kind of confine those cattle to the SSSI, particularly because they're already doing the kind of what we need them to do, which is grazing the SSSI. If they kind of tend not to go onto the steeper slopes, which is where the SSSI chalk grassland is, then because we have this internal fencing encapsulating the SSSI, we can kind of confine them into there, lock them in there, and they can do the grazing that needs to be done. But I fully anticipate that the cattle will range across the site, will go into the SSSI areas and browse and graze it sufficiently, but we'll see. This is the fencing, the SSSI fencing, which is in the process of being put in at the moment. And this is the SSSI slope. As you can see, it's pretty rank and tussocky. When it was designated, it was really nice, short, tightly grazed chalk grassland with areas of emergent shrubland, scrub. I prefer the word shrubland to scrubland. And there's the bowl, there's Liscombe Bowl, which the kind of the back edge, the northern edge, which is in kind of centre frame now, was arable, but that was reseeded by the previous owner using brush harvested seed from Salisbury Plain training area. So there are, that's turning into pretty good chalk grassland with species more associated with kind of South Wiltshire than necessarily the Dorset Downs. So it's an interesting kind of a point there. But Liscombe Bowl, the Valley of Reeds, I think Liscombe means, which means this bowl would have been soggier than it is now. And we hopefully will be kind of doing some resetting of this bowl in terms of the wetland element, and reigniting the spring lines and re-establishing some of the sogginess, some of the seepages and springs and wetlands components that would have been part of this landscape when it was called the Valley of Reeds, Liscombe. Let's get down this way a little bit. This fencing isn't completed yet, so it needs to be attached at the top with barbed wire strand along the top. But yeah, so it's quite widely debated whether rewilding sites should be fenced. And I think where you have animals such as we will have here, cattle, to replace the globally extinct aurochs, I think self-evidently you need to fence a site. The same with sites that have European bison. For now at least, because we don't have any rewilding sites that are as big as the ranging behaviour of those of aurochs. I don't think we know for sure, but logically aurochs, a large grazing herbivore, grazing and browsing herbivore, would have been quite wide ranging across landscapes, over tens of square kilometres for a herd. and we don't have rewilding sites on that scale here yet. So therefore you need fencing, and probably, you know, ultimately you'll probably need some sort of maybe no fence type solution for in those kind of systems where you do have cattle, rewilded sort of cattle. We couldn't do a no fencing solution here. We did need physical fences because reception for collars is very poor, and they're quite labour intensive anyway, looking after cattle in no fence grazing systems, I gather. I've had no experience of it personally, but that's what I gather. So just to summarise, within this rewilding site we're kind of blessed to have species rich calcareous grassland that depends on grazing. It's a SSSI. The wider site is poorer for biodiversity, and we needed to fence in the SSSI area to get it back into favourable condition. And in time it will become unremarkable because the wildlife that is within the SSSI will spread out across the wider landscape. Initially as kind of a open shrubby grassland, gradually going through ecological succession towards kind of wood pasture with some areas of closed woodland, some areas of more open woodland, and some areas of very open shrubland, shrubby grassland. Very rich in the kind of the calcareous wildflowers you would expect to have been in this kind of landscape under the influence of wild herbivores, aurochs, wild horse, native deer, prior to farming arriving. And yeah, we'll have to see how things unfold at Liscombe, but thanks for coming along, and stay tuned for the next video.